This is Session 1, Part 1, IB study session for history, Paper 3. We will be covering the War for American Independence and initially the causes of the American Independence movement in our first video. Those of you should have access to the IB Dogs blog, where you will have looked at this materials for Paper 3 section, and we will be covering primarily these 3 bullet points found here under independence movements. We'll start with this section here, independence movements, political, economic, social, intellectual, religious causes, conflicts and issues leading to war. In our second video, most likely, we will look at political, intellectual contribution of leaders, particularly Washington, Adams, Jefferson. We will look at, in our probably the third video, the D of I, the processes leading to the Declaration, and potentially in a fourth video, the military campaigns, as well as we'll skip back up here and hit foreign recognition. In looking at the causes of the American independence movement, we're going to start with the immediate spark, much as you remember with World War I. Everyone knows that the Archduke's assassination is that flashpoint, that spark. We studied a lot of things last year, the Boston Massacre, the Stamp Act, and many of the underlying causes. When we boil it down today, we want to focus on the Boston Tea Party as the more immediate flashpoint. The equivalent of Lincoln's election for the Civil War, the equivalent of the Archduke for World War I, is the Boston Tea Party in 1773. And remember, this was in response to the British trade restrictions, which required Americans to purchase their tea from the British East India Tea Company. In response, the stevedores and dock workers in Boston and many other cities refused to unload the tea, and therefore, and particularly in Boston, they one night threw the tea in the harbor. In response, the British enacted the Coercive Acts. They closed Boston Harbor. They dissolved the local legislative assembly, the Massachusetts self-government. And this led to a wave of sympathy for Boston, which they actually lost by the Tea Party. Lexicon, Lexington Concord follows that. As the British feared a armed rebellion, they sought to confiscate the weapons, and shots were fired. The Americans tried to intercept the British. Shots are fired, and leads to the more direct process of independence, the Second Continental Congress, and the Declaration. Okay, that's that sort of immediate sequence of events. If we look back at our curriculum bullet point, the type of question we might get, independence movements in the Americas, political, economic, social. A common question on this bullet might look something like this, such as, I guess I can type that for you. Possible question. We'll say the American independence movement was primarily caused by political factors. To what extent do you agree? Something like that. It could be economic factors. It could be, those are really the two most likely. You could get a question that asks you to compare it to 2 independence movements in the region. You would only likely choose it as a really strong question that you want to answer if it was strictly the United States. The question was, would the Boston Tea Party be political or economic? Well, I think the answer there is that it reflects, primarily economic factors, I would say. But then the result, the coercive acts, led to political shutdown. That Boston had its not only its economy crushed, because Boston was a harbor town, so closing the harbor, but also had its political authority usurped with the closing of the council. Okay. So we'll break this down into the overall, and then I'll run through each of those 5 things: political, economic, social, religious, and intellectual. Overall, because again, if you're looking at knocking out an essay on the topic of what were the main reasons, was it social, was it political, I would draw a lot of attention to the Tea Party, the coercive acts, that really signaled an act of bad faith on the part of the British to many of the American colonists. It was considered an overreaction. Many people remember that there had been that sequence of other things: the Proclamation of 1763, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre, all those other events which are relevant, worthwhile to go back and study, but it really had settled down. There was a period of stability that had emerged. And but what with the Boston Tea Party, then the coercive acts, it marked a fundamental shift for a lot of people, that there was a bad faith on the part of the British, and that they overreacted. They really sought the economic ruin of the whole colony of Massachusetts with the closing of Boston Harbor, and that they gave their local councils no rights, and they were to be ruled by a military governor. So as far as their political rights being in existence, as well as their economic livelihood being benefited by being members of the British Empire, the coercive acts really were a shutdown of Boston and Massachusetts in a very strong way. The end of salutary neglect. We heavily developed that as a theme last year. Again, we marched through the 1700s, where we talked about all the wars, the civil wars in Britain, the Revolution, or should I say the British Civil War, and then followed by the series of 18th century wars with France, which were sort of world wars. And during that time of the colony's early development, they were greeted with a type of salutary neglect. Salutary meaning, friendly, but nevertheless a neglect, a welcome neglect that meant that during that time they were exceedingly free, particularly the white men. But among that group, they were you could argue, were the freest people in the world of all time, as far as a large class of people. And then starting with the defeat of France in 1763, when the French lost the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War, they enacted new policies, decrees, acts of Parliament that passed restrictions that were really quite mild. The people of the United States, people of America, were quite free, but the catch is they were not as free as they used to be. So that's the whole point of salutary neglect, and how you would use that as evidence in your essays, is that there was salutary neglect that was withdrawn, and while it did leave Americans still quite free, there was a change. It was not what they were used to. Political causes. We could look at the issue of representation. In many ways, such as that series of acts, the Townshend, the Stamp, and particularly the coercive acts, they realized that, and Parliament stated this, and the King stated this, all power resided in Britain. Parliament was supreme, acting in concert with the King, and that anything that the colonies would do could be superseded by that. And that was the British view, and they declared it as such, the Declaratory Act, following the repeal of the Stamp Act, where they made it clear that it was the position of the British King and Parliament that they could override anything the colonies did, and they were beholden to the government in London. That there were still royal governors, there was still a parliament, that a lot of governing power still resided in the British, despite the fact that, say, common sense and the Enlightenment theory, tradition, their culture, had put more emphasis on the town councils and the state legislatures. And so the fact that Parliament had no representation of the colonists, and the fact that their local government could be undermined at any moment, it seemed like, particularly with the Coercive Act, such as in Massachusetts, the Coercive Act, they felt they could be undermined. The other big one with the United States independence would be economic factors. The United States and the colony, the 13 colonies, did not really face economic ruin. The taxes were relatively low, quite lower generally than those that applied in other parts of the empire, but keep in mind that they were higher than they used to be, which was the chief problem. They also tended to be a problem for the wealthier class, particularly shippers, merchants, and those were important, powerful people and played an important, powerful role in the Congresses that pushed for independence. It's not all taxes, but also the trade restrictions that existed, such as the monopoly for the East India Company, which directly led to the Tea Party and then the Coercive Acts, which is the crisis that set off the independence movement. Social factors would include simply that the societies had grown different, that the United States and Britain, the colonies, they had a different culture, distinctly American culture. Even elements of the language had begun to change. I'll skip ahead and do religious before we do intellectual, because it dovetails nicely with the social. Okay. In England, they had establishment churches, particularly the Church of England, and in the United States, it had begun to be seen as beneficial to have more independent churches. There was a strain of separatist churches in the United States, and the churches, which used to be something that tied us to Britain, there were increasing calls for and examples of churches that were pulling away from Britain. Intellectual is particularly easy to understand if we've studied our Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke. Jefferson directly quotes virtually from Locke that basic idea from English history and tradition particularly the example of the Glorious Revolution, where you could overthrow a government that the people felt was tyrannical, and it could be glorious, bloodless, and rather successful. To wrap up this session, I want to conclude with a few other thoughts on the causes of the independence movement in general. We've talked about the salutary neglect ending, and one of the reasons that they felt this gap between what they expected out of treatment and what they actually received was, in a sense, that, again, the white men of the colonies, but the colonists were somewhat spoiled. They experienced the best of both worlds. Prior to the end of salutary neglect, they had many benefits. They had British rights, British tradition, the protection of the British Navy, and the benefits of British trade, which was among some of the strongest in the world. And they had very few costs. They had near total self-rule with very little British oversight. Religion was almost entirely a local affair. They had no nobility and almost no taxes. And what with the end of the French and Indian War, it was the end of salutary neglect, so the costs go up. Their taxes went up, and furthermore, it was the end of the French boogeyman. There was no longer much need for the British protection. So the benefit wasn't as beneficial, and the costs of the empire went up. And so that makes the end of the French and Indian War as a watershed, the end of salutary neglect, and then the tea in Boston Harbor following into the Coercive Acts is another watershed moment.